Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Radical Candor podcast. I'm Kim Scott, co-founder of Radical Candor and author of A Radical Candor and Just Work.
I'm Jason Rosoff, CEO and co-founder of Radical Candor.
And I'm Amy Sandler, your host for the Radical Candor podcast. So unless you've been totally ignoring all forms of news and social media, aside from this podcast, of course, you have been hearing about the cascade of layoffs at myriad tech companies. And maybe you're one of the thousands of people who recently learned they were out of a job. And maybe you learned about it by email. And so we've been thinking about you all. And we're going to talk about layoffs from a few different perspectives. And the most important one is really about the impact on people who are being laid off. And because this is feeling for us like a really important topic, and for those of you who, like me, spent too much time watching television, kind of like a special episode of Blossom, we're doing something special today, and Jason is going to be taking over the hosting. So Jason, with that, over to you.
Thanks, Amy. To be clear, one of the things that we talked about as we were preparing for this episode was I was the only one of us who had never been laid off. And so it felt very appropriate for me to take a step back into the hosting role to elevate the stories of people who have been through this, because we think that's going to be really important. So to kick us off, in 2019, there was an article in Vice by writer Eliana Lev, who puts it pretty bluntly. When it comes to shitty life milestones, being laid off and contracting an STI have some remarkable similarities. I speak from experience. Both make you question your self-worth, feel a deep level of shame and self-consciousness, and stress about long-term effects. But unlike STIs, there's not much you can do to actively protect yourself against a layoff. In the last decade, Lev continues, I have been laid off without cause from 6 jobs. The distinction of without cause means the reason for the layoff isn't personal or performance-based and generally relates to the company's restructuring. Essentially, it's not you, it's us. This doesn't make the experience any less disorienting. Despite my familiarity with this often surreal situation, I can assure you it's not something that gets easier every time. Seems like 2023 tech is the new 2008 journalism. I think you all have some experiences to add to what this writer noted. And I think there's some real power in sharing our stories to remove some of the stigma around layoffs. So, Kim, I'd love to hear your story.
I think there are 2 kinds of stories, as Lev sort of pointed out. One is the story about the layoff that really had to happen, and your boss was as kind as possible, and it still sucks, but you don't feel betrayed. I don't have one of those stories, but maybe somebody else does. And then there are the sort of what I call the insult to injury stories. These are the institutional betrayal stories. These are the much, much harder to recover from. These are the stories where not only maybe did the layoff not have to happen, so there are real layoffs, and then there are phony baloney layoffs. And also your boss treated you terribly. So I'll start by telling a story about getting laid off. This was from my very first job. I was working in Moscow, and I want to acknowledge that that has all kinds of layers right now, given the invasion of Ukraine. But this was back a long, long time ago in 1991, I think. Yeah, 1991. Maybe it was early 92. And I was living there, and our boss called us all up and said, get on an airplane and fly to Helsinki. I'm pulling out of Russia. And so I had been living there for 2 years, and I had exactly 2 hours to get to the airport. And, he said, you're never going back. Like, why did he think that he got to decide whether or not I went back where I lived? But anyway, so we were in this holding pattern in Helsinki for a while. And then he flew us back to Boston. And he asked us not to get another job. He said, I'm not going back, but maybe, I'll be able to sell this team to somebody else. So don't get another job. And he said, I'll pay you for a little while. But meanwhile, I was getting so dramatically underpaid. I could not afford to live in Boston. I literally moved into a friend's closet, in my high school friend's closet. So I decided this was all BS. There were a lot of other problems with it. I decided I didn't want to stay even if he did manage to sell. So I got another job. And when he heard that I got another job, he was furious, even though he had just laid me off. And he was like, questioned my loyalty. So I said to him, well, the new job that I got pays twice as much as you're paying me. And then he looks at me and he's like, you're just in it for the money. Like, we were in finance. What was he in it for? So anyway, I mean, it's funny now, but it really was upsetting at the time. I felt gaslit. I sort of felt disoriented. And I think this is the second time we've recorded this podcast. I realized after we recorded it that I still had some kind of unprocessed trauma from that experience. So it was upsetting.
I mean, it makes sense to me that that was upsetting. There was a distinct absence of care personally there, right? No, there was no yes, recognition at all of the effect that this decision was having on your life. And I think it's interesting that he chose to use loyalty as a weapon against you when he was being incredibly disloyal to you.
Yes, indeed. And yet this like Darvo, deny, attack, reverse victim and offender, it works. It's kind of a form of gaslighting that really works. I mean, the problem, well, there were many, many problems with that job, but one of them was that I was literally paid a fourth, not 25% less, but 1/4 of what I should have been paid.
Well, I just want to acknowledge that as you were thinking back on this unfair situation that happened to you many years ago, and it sort of raised up some unprocessed feelings, I think that that's probably something folks listening to the podcast may encounter over time as they sort of deal with their response to this layoff, that there's a grieving process that happens when you lose something that was important or valuable to you, even if it's done in a crappy way. And even if you know that it's not fair or it's unjust, and there's a sense of disorientation, frustration, anger may over time give way to an acknowledgement that it's very hard to resolve those feelings when you feel like it came from betrayal. Like the source of the original decision was actually one that betrayed the relationship that you had with your boss or with your team.
To continue processing my unprocessed trauma, I think that for folks listening, like part of what was so hard about it is that, I mean, actually he did have to leave Russia. Like he did need to shut that down. The business case was legitimate, but the way he handled it was so horrible. And also, I think the shame of having to beg my friend to live in her closet was like, don't feel ashamed to ask for help. If I could go back and advise my younger self, I would say this is not your fault, Kim. Your friend is happy to do you a favor. There's no reason to feel ashamed that way.
Amy, I know you went through some similar sort of emotional processing, but your story is quite different. Would you share with us your experience?
Sure. And just to bring up this idea of shame and embarrassment and identity, I was talking this morning about how I threw my back out over the weekend. And what was really embarrassing about it was that it was bending over to pick up my dog's leash, which is not a really, from my mind, exciting story of how one throws one's back out. And I was talking to a friend and they were like, it's so interesting why like that we think of these things as embarrassing and shame. And it's like really unpacking those stories we tell ourselves, like I should be someone who has a really strong back and I should be someone who's, doing pole vaulting, et cetera. And so I think looking at what's underneath the shame and the sense of identity harm that's happening there. So just to get into my layoff story, but I think it's a familiar feeling of that shame and betrayal that Kim mentioned, even if it's a different story. And so for people who might have something in common with me, which is that I self-identify as a recovering perfectionist. At the time when this happened, I was just a straight up old-fashioned perfectionist, no recovery whatsoever, and had always prided myself, defined myself, identified myself as someone who was great and straight A's and Harvard and sort of doing everything the best. And my performance reviews actually showed that as well. And so I think part of it was the shock of, just a couple weeks after like yet another great performance review, was learning that my job had been eliminated. And so there was just this sense of shock. I think it can be similar maybe to a relationship where you think everything's going great and now someone is leaving you, et cetera. So there's sort of like the gut punch of really not being prepared for it. And the first thought just went to the finances and to Kim, what you were talking to. And I did have the benefit of a severance package. I did have the benefit of the Harvard Business School degree, et cetera. But I just share that I didn't feel like I had all of these options, even though my background might have suggested all of these options. In the moment, that wasn't how it felt, because I'm someone that really values security. And so I was just going through the numbers of what am I going to do? How long is this going to last? What am I going to, sort of do after the severance package runs out? And so that added to, I think the larger psychological toll, which is what I really want to share with listeners, is just really acknowledging, being with, validating a sense of betrayal. And it felt like a very personal betrayal, even though I can look at it from, strategically and see why it happened. And I would say, even if the layoff had been done, and if as a perfectionist, quote, perfectly, which I don't think it was done that way, but the betrayal came from what I was contributing to the job and what I was getting in return. And so going back, Kim, to that sort of what I would tell my younger self, like this was a time in my career, I was putting 12 hours a day into the job. And even when I wasn't, quote, working, I was still worried about work, losing sleep about work, worrying about work. And so it was taking up such a huge sort of toll in my psyche. So then to have that trade-off, then getting laid off after what I felt like, after everything I've done. And so for me, one tip that I would give my younger, more anxious self is like just really looking at how out of balance I was in terms of just like how much energy I was putting into something and what I was getting back. And is that a trade-off that I wanted to make? So that was kind of one lesson that I took from that. I think an even deeper one is around identity. We were talking about this on our team call, and I think that certainly I was someone that, even though there were lots of things about the job that was frustrating, I was getting my sense of purpose, my sense of meaning. My primary identity was really coming from this job, sort of warts and all. And before I go into the identity thing, I just want to bring in like Kim, Jason, like, have you ever been in a situation like that where you were fully identified with your job?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that as you were talking, it was spurring thoughts about that first job I had in Russia, where, again, it was like 80 hours a week, 90 hours a week. I never talked to anyone who I didn't work with, and I only worked with a few people. And when all of a sudden it was over and I had free time, sort of free time forced upon me, I made myself a real promise that I would never work that many hours again and totally neglect all my relationships outside of work. And yeah, so the balance, it was a big lesson in balance. And I realized, even though I was having all these terrible feelings of shame about living in the closet, I was so much happier all of a sudden living in that closet.
To be clear, it was a literal closet.
It was literally someone's closet. It was a big closet. She had a big walk-in closet, and it was big enough for like a little futon.
Yeah, you're a pretty small, diminutive
I'm a small person. Yeah. I'm only 5 feet tall.
So a big closet, it could work.
Yeah, it worked. It worked for a little while. I mean, I really will never live in a place without a window again, though. That was the other thing I learned. But in all seriousness, I think that realization of the importance of keeping your relationships outside of work, it was really important.
I was just going to build on that by saying, I think there's a strong correlation between there's a very tight feedback loop in some jobs where the harder you work, the better results you can achieve. And so for people who value achievement, especially work-related achievement, it's sort of an addictive feedback loop which is what I think leads a lot of people to wind up spending an inordinate amount of time at work, which then starts to cost them other relationships outside of work, until the point where a lot of people realize, oh, like the vast majority of my relationship time is spent with people with whom I work, and very little of it is spent with people outside of my work. And I think many of us define our identities not just based on what we do, but on who we spend time with. When you combine those two things, like I think highly of what I do, and that is important to me. And all the people who I spend time with also value me for the exact same reason, because they know that I'm good at what I do. Now you have this very sort of toxic stew of motivators, right? Like there's both your social relationships and the work that you're doing are reinforcing this, all good things come to me through work. And I think that's how it can wind up feeling like something's being ripped away from you when that situation changes, especially when it's out of your control, like in a layoff.
The other thing I'll say about that is I think that feedback loop is often a false feedback loop. Like I found in my next job where I did not work that many hours that I actually did better work, lo and behold. When I had perspective, I did much better work, achieved much better results, and was way happier when I was working 30 to 40 hours a week as opposed to 60 to 90.
So just to get back to the story and bringing in what you were saying about the kind of the social feedback loop and identity, I will say, one of the things I loved about that job was the people and was the relationships. And this was a time in an organization. I was doing a lot of travel. There was a lot of in-person time. There were a lot of events. And so it really was very nourishing, very enriching, very exciting socially. And so that was a real loss. And there's people I'm still very connected to now. But I think, Jason, when you were saying that about the social sort of identity part of it, one of the things I'm so grateful for with Radical Candor is that I am someone who, one of the ways in which I build relationship is through doing shared work together. Like that's very satisfying for me. So when we had to shift things in 2020, going from an in-person company to a virtual company, and that was really kind of scary and stressful, and you were, very transparent and so strategic, but having this group of people that I could connect with, not just in an emotional way, but actually just doing problem solving and creativity, that was such a wonderful way to get through a very uncertain time. And at least for me, that is something I really value. So I think that was a big loss to lose that. The part that was not the loss that was helpful was all of the extra worry and stress that I was bringing into the work. So I think kind of decoupling those parts of sort of where my time in that job was going and what was really within my agency to control and what was kind of a real loss. But to go back to this identity thing, and Kim, we didn't know each other in business school. I think we had very different paths. And so grateful we kind of came back together probably around 10 years ago to meet. But I was doing all of this personal development work and meditation and mindfulness and really on this spiritual path. And what happened with this layoff was that it was a little bit of a, Jason, what you might call a forcing function. For me, it was literally like the rubber was meeting the road. It's like, it's all well and good to practice meditation and read books about letting go. But like, you really have to let this kind of piece of your identity as someone who's perfect. And that's really not all of who you are. And I was really forced to look at it. Every year I would go on this meditation retreat and do fire walking. And I would say, I'm leaving this job. And then every year I wouldn't, and I would stay kind of safe and potentially stuck until finally it was like, you are leaving this job. And so I really had to put this in action. I was serving as a mentor in a mindfulness training program, and I had to show up for the first meeting where you're meeting the people that you're guiding and mentoring. And I had to show up as someone without a job. And, these are the kinds of environments where this isn't who you really are. And it's not, how you can describe yourself at cocktail parties. So I really had to model this, like, I'm showing up as me, and that's enough, and deal with the discomfort of potentially feeling other people's judgment, but mostly my own self-judgment and shame of, without sort of this external descriptor of who I am and how special and important and successful I am, how am I really showing up? So that was actually, for me, one of the best ways to really work through that discomfort of being seen as someone who something kind of crappy happened to. And I will say, as a teacher, it's those moments that actually make it even more relatable, more human. It's like, hey, I'm dealing with this thing. For me, that's my intention in this podcast, is that this stuff happens. There's going to be emotion. And even talking about it all these years later, Kim, like you're saying, you're still processing it. I think when we acknowledge it, it makes us richer as humans and more able to be empathetic and compassionate.
Yeah, as you were talking, Amy, I was thinking about another thing that happened. This was a different point in my life when I was also unemployed. I was at this talk, and at the talk, when you asked a question, it was like a foreign policy thing. When you asked a question, you had to state your name and affiliation. And I'm like, oh gosh, I have to say then I was Kim Malone. I'm Kim Malone and I'm unemployed. Meanwhile, like all these fancy muckety mucks are raising their hand and stating their name and affiliation. And one guy was retired and he said, I'm so-and-so and I'm unaffiliated. And I'm like, oh, that's what I'll say. And so I raised my hand, I asked my question. I said, I'm Kim and I'm unaffiliated. And some guy in the background yells out, unaffiliated or unattached. And it was mostly men in the audience. I wanted to be bold, but I almost burst into tears. I was so humiliated in that moment. So all I can say to my younger self is don't let the bastards get you down.
I am so frustrated on your behalf, Kim. And the one thing I will say, we are of a certain age, and I feel like one of the gifts of this present moment is that people are is there a little less shame about being laid off? I feel like we're in a somewhat of a different time where that we can even have this conversation. I don't know, Kim, that you and I would have had this conversation 10 years ago.
I think it may be because we're in our 50s, not because the times have changed, but we're a bit older. There are some real advantages to being older. I will say that. Well, as somebody said to me recently, the great thing about turning 50 is you don't have a fuck left to give. I do literally, but metaphorically, I don't.
I think there's another thing that you have, which is distance and perspective from these events that we're discussing. To some extent, there's a process that you both described of continuously putting these experiences into context, right? Each experience you had afterward provided another way to put this experience into context. And it seems so trivial and so trite to sort of say, this too shall pass, right? There's an image that one of my favorite Zen Buddhist teachers uses all the time, which is that he uses to describe emotion, which is a lot of the time when we're experiencing a strong emotion, it's like looking out and seeing the branches of a tree blowing wildly in the wind of a storm. And that's what we focus on, is that wild movement. But we forget to look at the trunk of the tree, which is rooted very firmly in the ground. Even though we're experiencing these emotions very strongly, it's important to remember that we do have these roots. And I think part of what I hear both of you saying is look to those roots and don't neglect those roots, right? Kim, you were saying build these relationships outside of work because work may not always be there. In fact, work will not always be there. The one thing we can guarantee you is that things will change. And so find and nurture those roots. And Amy, you talked about the internal work of finding and nurturing roots, right? You talked about locating that internal strength, working on your internal dialogue. Is it bad to say dialogue? I think it's okay to say internal dialogue.
There's actually a lot going on, probably more than a dialogue and multilogue. But I will say I love the metaphor of the roots. There's another one around a flagpole, but I like the tree and the roots because it really is, in terms of, for me, these moments when all of the work, certainly that I had been doing, that, folks listening are doing in terms of self-awareness and managing emotions and building relationships and building kind of your inner resourcefulness, your inner sturdiness. It doesn't mean that it doesn't hit like a gut punch, but I think I can look back on it and see sort of what happened. So if it's helpful for people who are literally in the middle of it and you feel like your tree was just chopped down, let me share kind of how my tree and the branches and how that developed. I had a few months. And by the way, this became one of my Radical Candor stories where I talked about kind of the country song period in my life where I lost my job, I lost my relationship, my cat died, I got burned in a fire. I still had my dog. Of course, he would die too. So, I don't want to get all maudlin. But
that's the country song period.
It's the country song. It was the country song part. And then I say, of course, I had a pickup truck. I was like, but I lived in LA. It was not a pickup truck. It was an SUV. But nonetheless, it was a really hard time. I'm someone that tends to believe the sort of tragedy plus time and ends up being a good story to share with a little humor. And so for me, having the humor to look back on it, in the moment, though, what happened was after a few months, I was like, I need a job. I got this job. And what was this job? This job was basically the exact same job that I'd had before that I was miserable in. The only difference was different people at an office, and there was a different name on my laptop. And I literally felt like I was in Groundhog Day, and I had moved to a different city, and I woke up every morning and I would record myself into my phone, and I would just be crying and depressed and miserable, and I can't take it. And then I would sort of laugh at myself, but it was really like the low trajectory of this country song. But I will say, in terms of takeaways, one is that I needed a job. And so I was making a very intentional choice for my financial security, which was my top priority. And I will say that that job led me to where I am now. It was pretty much a straight shot from that job to me going off on my own to become a speaker and a coach, and all of these sort of seeds I had been planting over those last few years of coaching and training. That's what came to fruition. So I do have the benefit of looking back in those difficult moments. I couldn't have painted exactly what it looked like, although there were a bunch of vision boards and it came mostly true. But I will say, when you are in the thick of it, if it's helpful to know that there can be a new future that you're just not seeing in this moment.
I think that brings us to a really important point, which is the stories that we've told help to validate a lot of the feelings that people are having. But I think one question that's on a lot of people's minds is practically, what do I do now? I have been laid off. Now what? And so I'm curious, Kim, if you have any guidance to share with people about some practical steps that they can take to help manage this transition as effectively as possible.
Well, I will say when I got laid off, I didn't know what to do. I was sort of paralyzed, and I, was very lucky. There was a colleague of mine who called me up and said, "This is a bunch of bullshit, Kim. I'm going to introduce you to someone and you need to get another job." So I was kind of frozen, and I was very lucky that this person who I worked with had a brother who was taking a job back in Moscow and needed someone to help him figure out what to do. And so that was how I got the other job. But I learned a couple of things. One of the things that I learned was once I had gotten that job and I was back in Russia and back connecting with friends and not working all the time, I had a couple of people say, "Why didn't you tell me you were looking? I would have hired you." And so I think that one of the things that I would recommend is start talking to people. You may feel like, I'm not ready to have these conversations. I'm not ready to interview. I need to heal. And if you feel that way, heal. But you can reach out to friends and tell them that you're going to be looking in a month. The other thing I would recommend is kind of figure out, what can you do to keep paying the rent? Do you have a friend whose closet you can live in? What can you do to make sure that you're going to be okay while you mend? And the other thing that I would say is, and this is hard, I wish maybe other people have better advice on this, but try to figure out, you do have the gift of time, which you probably didn't have before. When you were working, you were probably too busy all the time. Now you have a little bit too much time. Try to figure out what you can do with that time that will make it a salve to you, that will help you get yourself to a better place. That's much, I want to acknowledge that's much, much easier said than done. But the thing that I did was I had dinner with a bunch of different friends and talked to a bunch of different people. And that was a big help. So I kept myself occupied in that way. But I also had a stack of novels that I really wanted to read. And I allowed myself the luxury of spending all day in bed reading. And that helped me sort of mend a little bit. I don't know. What do other people think? What do you do? I think Brandi, I know that you don't love public appearances, but I think you had some words of wisdom. I would love to, if you don't mind me putting you on the spot, I'd love to hear from you.
Well, I've never been laid off, but when I did leave my job intentionally, I traveled. I did spend a lot of time reading also by the pool, like trying to take time to heal. But yeah, I reached out to my network and I just kept applying for things and cobbled together a freelance career that served me well for about 3 years until I joined Radical Candor full time. But I just always had some sort of irons in the fire because you just do never know when you're going to make that next connection.
Yeah, it's hard. It's really hard. Financially, it can be tricky.
Like you also put together a sort of parallel path for yourself in the coaching and meditation and these other things that were of interest to you, but weren't necessarily your career in air quotes.
Yeah, I really appreciate how you frame that, because when I was wanting to be a full-time meditation teacher and coach, et cetera, there really wasn't kind of a marketplace for that. And so I think there's some not only self-awareness of what kind of job do you want, what are your strengths, but also what is valuable in the marketplace and what's maybe a hobby and what's something that you could actually get paid for, and being very clear about those things. So when I left a job to start to go on my own to be a coach and a speaker, first of all, I did use little savings I had. So I know, Brandi, we were talking about that, of there was a sense of an investment in my future and some trust that it was going to pay off. So it wasn't a forever strategy, but it was really like, I am taking this leap. I'm finally ready to take this leap. I think the layoff had given me the fortitude of saying that you need to make some changes. And if you say this is the direction you want to move in, this is the direction you want to move in. So I had done a bunch of training that was separate from my job. It wasn't part of my job, but it started now becoming my job. And I've coached people who want to become coaches, and I say, what is your financial path? It can be very helpful when those trainings aren't necessarily tied to money, so that you might have your kind of day job, but you can start, maybe you're leading a meditation class on the weekend. So you're almost decoupling the financial part from getting the experience. So I ended up doing a bunch of speaking engagements that weren't necessarily paying my rent, but I got the reps in of having coached probably thousands of CEOs on mindfulness, which then enabled for that to become my full-time job. So I think there's a way you can start to get practice in where you want to move into while you might be doing something else for the income piece.
I just want to add too, I think I oversimplified how I survived when I left my job. There's a lot of advice out there about what you should and shouldn't do. And I think you have to do what is best for you. I cashed in my 401k. That people say you shouldn't do that. I racked up a lot of credit card debt because I couldn't pay my rent. I got a roommate, and that's how I survived for several years. And I just paid off that credit card debt January of this year. But I wouldn't have gotten through that time if I hadn't broken all those rules, because I don't have any family support and I didn't have anyone to help me. So I kind of had to figure it out on my own, and it worked out.
And I just want to say how impressed I am, Brandi, because that is scary and hard what you did. And you're willing to make an investment in yourself and to believe that it would work out. And I think there is a lot of wisdom in doing that. It's scary, but I think there's a lot of conventional wisdom out there that doesn't recognize the situation that you listeners may be in. And if you need to break the rules or not follow conventional wisdom, we're here cheering you on.
I wanted to kind of amplify, Brandi, what you were saying in terms of shame and stigmas, since we are dipping into that is that I had a lot of shame around being in debt and feeling like I should have had all this financial success. I had gone in a very different and untraditional direction. But just in the same way we might feel shame about layoffs, we might feel shame about going off the beaten path. I still feel some shame around debt. And so I think just naming it and breaking free of that, that was a huge accomplishment. I know what a huge accomplishment that was for you, Brandi. I'm curious, did you feel any shame around the debt?
I don't feel shame around debt because I guess I've always been in debt. I still have a very high student loan debt. I assume I will go to my grave with those loans. But I don't think society is set up in a way for people to survive necessarily without accumulating debt. And when I hear all of those, how you become a billionaire, paid for everything in cash, where does this cash come from? How do you get it? Is there a bag behind a tree that somebody's going to show me? If you don't have generational wealth or you're not in finance, how do you make these things happen? So I felt that I was very proud that I had a good credit score. So it wasn't like I was accumulating a lot of unnecessary interest, but I didn't necessarily feel shame around having the debt. And I feel like you have to do what you have to do. I have friends who were laid off from network jobs and worked at yogurt shops, and you have to cobble together whatever life you can. And I don't think there's any shame in any of that.
Yes.
I agree.
I think there's an important thread that I want to tie up here, which is that everybody's path dealing with a layoff or sudden loss of income is going to be different. And that the guidance that we're offering, which I would say amounts to a couple of things, which is one, prioritize yourself, your health and well-being. It's rare for most people to have even a moment in their career, a month or 2 months in their career, where they don't absolutely have to work. So if you're one of these folks who has a severance package from a layoff, this may be a unique opportunity to invest in yourself. So taking care of yourself, number one. Number two, be practical about what that means. So you may be able to read all day in bed for a week or 2 weeks, and that's it. That might be all the time that you have before you need to get back out there and start to hustle to try to figure out what the next thing is going to look like. But the important thing that I heard all of you say was you didn't go it alone necessarily, right? You're reaching out to network contacts or people you'd worked with previously to say, hey, I'm in this position. This is what I'm trying to do. I'm just letting you know. No expectation that you're going to give me a job, but I wanted you to know the situation that I'm in so that if you have suggestions for me, you might be able to offer them. And then the last thing was you invested in the kind of work that mattered to you. You took this as an opportunity to see if there was a path forward in the kind of work that mattered, that felt like it was important to you. And, whether or not that pans out in the short term, I think those moments of clarity where we can actually say, hey, I feel like this is pointing me in a new direction might set up opportunities for the future. So even if it doesn't immediately transition, you might be in Amy's case where you take the job that's exactly like the other job that you just left, and it sort of makes you miserable, but it actually is building a foundation for the step that you might want to take more clearly in a direction of your dreams. But I think using this time wisely is the thing that I'm hearing from you all as treat this as a strategic opportunity to invest in yourself, your health, your well-being, and the type of path that you want to take forward, but do that with a practical mindset. Don't starve yourself trying to take the next step in the direction of your dreams. And don't listen to anybody else when they tell you that you're doing it the wrong way, because there is no one right way.
Yeah.
Jason, I always love your summaries. Can I make one slight tweak as I heard you say on the investing your time wisely? What's going in my head is I'm like, oh God, I'm eating a lot of French fries and ice cream and self-medicating through this time. And so I also feel like it's important for people to give yourself a little grace and compassion as you're navigating through all of this. Oh crap, why didn't I start talking to people 3 months ago, and now I'm really behind the 8 ball here, and it's been 6 months and it's been a year. So just wherever you are right now, kind of starting really slow, because I think one of the challenges can be feeling like you've wasted this time.
Here's my shame. As you were talking about like learning meditation and all these very healthy responses, like what did I do? I drank way too much. That's what I did. I can't drink at all now. In fact, I'm not saying that was a healthy response, but whatever it takes to, get you through the day, like don't feel bad about it. Be kind to yourself. Cut yourself some slack.
So one important practical thing, I know we're talking about ways of using our time and healthy responses, but one thing I wanted to make sure that we mentioned is that many people who are part of a layoff may in fact be eligible for a very specific type of support, which is unemployment. And it's important to recognize that everybody who has a job in this country pays into unemployment in their state. So this is a benefit that you have already paid for.
You've earned it.
And yes, correct. You have earned it. There is some stigma out there about collecting unemployment for some people. And we just wanted to call that out, that given that one of the biggest risks that people face during a layoff is financial risk, it's important to take advantage of the financial resources that are available to you. This is the most ubiquitous one, but it may depend on your state's or specific laws about your eligibility. So you can always reach out to your state unemployment office to find out more about your eligibility for unemployment. But you, Kim, and Amy, and Brandi, you all talked about reaching out to your networks. And so the thing that I want to close with is some practical guidance for people about how to make that outreach. Like, what are some good ways to reach out to people? Since I think a lot of people are going to be picking up the phone or sending an email in the coming weeks or months to someone in their network.
I think one of the things that is most important is just to tell people exactly what you need. So, for example, if someone reaches out to me and says, "Do you want to get coffee?" My answer is no. I don't want to get coffee. But
what about tea?
No tea, no coffee. Like, I'm working on a book. Like, I want to sit alone in my garage and write. I'm making myself sound like a real jerk. But if you send me an email and say, "I'm unemployed and I just got laid off and I'm looking for a job. Can you introduce me to so-and-so?" The answer will always be yes. And if I don't see the email, just resend it. Yes is the answer. And if you say, I just got laid off and I want to learn more about writing a book, will you talk to me for 15 minutes? The answer is yes. But so I don't think I'm unusual in this. People are generally very happy to help. My husband did this when he was unemployed for a while. He said, I have time. And so I will travel to people and have lunch with them for 20 minutes at their place of employment. I have time to do that right now. And he reconnected with a bunch of people who he really liked. And he said it was helpful in terms of finding the next job, but it was also fun. It was a good way to spend the day.
Yeah, Kim, just to add on to that, there along those lines of be professional. The things that my friends who are looking for opportunities will often say is, well, my coach or so-and-so told me I have to word the email this way and ask for this very specific thing to not let them know what I'm really asking for. And then they feel like, oh, they didn't respond to my email. When can I follow up? I have 20,000 unread emails in my personal inbox. I put an auto reply on there because I'm just not responding to you. And I want to know exactly what you want. If it's a vague thing about, can you maybe talk to me about something? The answer will be no. But if it's, hey, I'm looking for X, Y, and Z opportunity, I love helping to connect people and I'm happy to do that. And if I don't respond, it means I didn't see your email. So carrier pigeon, text message, however else you can get me. Just be clear and direct and don't worry about quote unquote being professional.
Yes, I 100% agree. That is excellent advice.
I will say one of the things I appreciate both about Brandi and Kim is your proactive connection. And I think we enable those proactive connections when we're very specific in what we're looking for. There was a research study, which I'm going to have to now track down, but basically showing that people who either lost their jobs or were laid off did some journaling. And it was just a couple of days of journaling, and it enabled them to get jobs more quickly. And I think part of it was the clarity that you gain in what specifically you're looking for. So if someone says, oh, I want a job in L&D, that's somewhat, but saying, I want to be a coach teaching mindfulness. Well, now I have something to get into and I can share my experience. I might not know about a job, but I might be able to give you the next person or the next organization you can talk to. So I think the more clarity you have for yourself, the more that helps that person you're asking for. And I will say one of the things that I feel really grateful to do now, having been on this other side, is I do welcome people that are, whether friends of friends or in my network, reaching out saying, hey, how did you get started doing this thing? How did you take the leap from a corporate job to where you are now? I would love to do something like that. And I say, I can't sort of tell you exactly what to do, but I'm happy to share my experience. And that sparks a really rich conversation. So I'm always happy to share what I've learned and also what didn't work so well.
What you're saying is really important. Different people are different. And so if you reach out to Amy and say, will you have coffee? Amy might say yes. Whereas
I love coffee.
Yeah. Whereas I might say no, but that doesn't mean that both Amy and I don't want to help you. You got to sort of spend a little extra time figuring out what's the right thing for that person.
And Kim, you have probably been the single most helpful person in my career.
But I never have had coffee.
But I will not ask you for coffee.
And you have also, I mean, I think it is mutual. It's not a one-way street. So.
Right.
Jason, do you want coffee? We had your story of how coffee was ruined for you from feedback conversations.
Yes, I think there are two things that are coming to mind for me, which is that for some people, when they're in a state of transition, even if you're in a job, but you're sort of mentally transitioning out of that job and trying to figure out what's next, if you're laid off or you've left a job voluntarily, I think there is another thing that you can reach out to your network for, which is to learn something new, to try to figure out, like, maybe there's a thing that I don't know that I'm interested in. And so I think that's the other type of outreach that we just described, which I think is really valuable, which is the sort of like learning about what other people are doing. And some people are more available to do that. But Kim, your example of like, you think you want to be an author, you want to write a book. I'm happy to spend 15 minutes sort of telling you a little bit about, what my experience is like or how that might work. And I think that it is a sort of unique moment when you're forced to take a step back and say, like, what is it that I want to do? Our networks are often really good for learning about new things or adjacent skills that we may not yet have.
And in fact, in the spirit of not just compassion, but actual help, one of the things we'd like to do for listeners out there who might have been laid off and who might be interested, not saying that you should be, but just in case you're interested in learning more about Radical Candor, send us an email. And Jason, you can give the email address. But it's learningsupport@radicalcandor.com. And we can share some resources that are usually paid, but we will make them unpaid for you if you're having financial situations.
Okay. So with that, I think now is the time for our Radical Candor checklist. Tips you can use to start putting what you've learned over the course of this conversation into practice. And today's list is short. We're going to go with 2 tips. So Amy, why don't you take the first one?
This is a time to over-index on the care personally part for yourself. This is a challenging emotional moment, and we've learned there's no one right way to navigate a layoff, so start with self-compassion.
And tip number 2, ask for help. Don't think about it in terms of asking for a handout. What you're doing is you're asking for an investment in you. You are a good investment. So ask for help. Be as clear as possible about what you need. And people usually, not always, but usually they're happy to help. They're eager to help, in fact. They're lucky to be able to invest in you.
For more tips, you can go to radicalcandor.com/resources to download our learning guides for practicing Radical Candor. To see the show notes for this episode, head over to radicalcandor.com/podcast. If you like what you hear, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. Have a career topic you'd like us to discuss on a future podcast, email us at podcast@radicalcandor.com. And last but not least, if you're looking for some Radical Candor swag, go to radicalcandor.com and click on the shop link to get your coffee mugs, magnets, notepads, and more. Bye for now.
Thanks for joining us. Our podcast features Radical Candor co-founders Kim Scott and Jason Rosoff, is produced by our Director of Content, Brandi Neal, and hosted by me, Amy Sandler. Music is by Cliff Goldmacher. Go ahead and follow us on Twitter at Candor and find us online at radicalcandor.com.